Kakola Prison, Turku, Finland, the port city on the southwestern coast of the Grand Duchy of Finland, then ruled by the Russian Empire, January 8, 1895. A prison guard opens the door to a cell in the pre-dawn hours and finds what he finds. The most notorious criminal in Finnish history is dead. He has taken his own life with a woolen thread pulled from his own sock. He was 49 years old. He had escaped from this prison 4 times. He had walked across Siberia. He had survived a self-inflicted stab wound to the chest, 7 separate blows he landed on himself when he realized his final escape attempt had failed. He had been brought back to Kakola, treated, and placed in a cell to await the verdict in his 3rd murder trial. And then, in the quiet of a January night, before any judge could render a verdict, before the Finnish legal system could put one more official label on a life it had spent 30 years trying to contain, Matti Haapoja made the only decision that had ever truly been his alone to make. To understand what this moment meant institutionally, you have to hold the full 28-year picture in your mind simultaneously. 3 confirmed murder trials across 3 decades of criminal proceedings. 4 separate escape investigations after each Kakola breakout. A decade of Siberian exile administration involving Russian imperial bureaucracy and diplomatic correspondence. A transcontinental extradition process when he returned uninvited. A 2nd murder trial and a commuted death sentence. A 5th escape attempt investigation. A 3rd murder trial about to begin. All of that institutional investment accumulated over 28 years, and the final accounting of it was a guard opening a cell door in the pre-dawn hours of January 8, 1895, and finding nothing left to try. The newspapers that covered his death compared him to Jack the Ripper. His skeleton was preserved in a museum of crime for 100 years before anyone thought to give him a burial. In Finnish criminal legend, he became a figure alongside the great outlaws and knife fighters of the era, a man whose name carried the specific weight of a society that had failed enough people that a few of them became something the system genuinely could not handle. So here's where this episode is going. Who was Matti Haapoja before the prison escapes and the body count? What did the Finland he was born into actually look like? And what did it do to the people at the bottom of it? How did a farmer's son from a small village in western Finland end up crossing the breadth of the Russian Empire on foot, killing as he went, and returning home to kill again? And what does it mean that a legal system that had been trying to hold this man since 1867 never once, in nearly 3 decades, managed to reach a final verdict while he was still alive to hear it? This is Enter the Crime, global true crime told like a documentary. If this kind of storytelling is what you're looking for, consider subscribing before we go any further. But to understand Matti Haapoja, we have to go back to the beginning, to a country in the grip of a catastrophe, and to a culture of violence that already had its own language and its own heroes before any of this began. Let us situate this properly. Finland in the 1840s and 1850s was not yet an independent country. It was a Grand Duchy, an autonomous region, within the Russian Empire, having been transferred from Swedish to Russian control in 1809. The Finnish language and Finnish cultural identity are real and increasingly assertive in this period, but political sovereignty is not. The land is governed from St. Petersburg. Finnish law operates within Russian imperial structures. And the economy is overwhelmingly agricultural, small farms, tenant farmers, a landless poor dependent on seasonal work and the goodwill of larger landholders, in a climate that turns hostile for months at a time and leaves very little margin for anything going wrong. Iso-Kairo is a municipality in the region of Ostrobothnia, a long, flat strip of western Finland running along the eastern coast of the Gulf of Bothnia, a body of water that separates Finland from Sweden. It is, in the 1840s, a rural farming community of the kind that defines most of Finland outside the handful of larger towns, flat agricultural land, a river, a Lutheran church at the center of community life, and a social order in which land ownership matters enormously and landlessness is close to a permanent condition, something you inherit from your parents along with their poverty, not something you easily escape. To understand what it meant to grow up in Ostrobothnia in the 1840s and 50s, you need to understand two things that the standard criminal biography of Haapoja tends to skip past. The first is the nature of Finnish rural poverty in this period. The second is the specific culture of violence that existed in Western Finland, which had its own vocabulary, its own hierarchy, and its own logic before the law or the press ever engaged with it. Finnish rural poverty in the mid-19th century was structural, not incidental. The economy depended on agriculture and forestry in a climate that regularly tested both. Landless laborers, farmhands, seasonal workers, people dependent on the harvest cycles of farms they didn't own, had almost no economic buffer against a bad year. A poor harvest meant debt. A second poor harvest meant destitution. The social system surrounding this poverty was rigid. Land ownership and the Lutheran Church gave social standing. Landlessness meant the absence of it. Men at the bottom of this hierarchy had limited legitimate paths upward and a very immediate set of pressures pushing downward. Matti Haapoja was born in Iso-Kairo on September 16, 1845, the son of a farmer. The fact that his father was a farmer and not a landless laborer gave Matti a slightly different starting position than the very worst of the rural poor. But farmer in 1840s Ostrobothnia covered a wide range of circumstances, from genuine prosperity to marginal subsistence, and the documented record suggests his family was toward the latter end of that range. What it did give him was proximity to the particular culture of Western Finland's rural communities, a culture that had its own complicated relationship with violence. The word I need to introduce here is puukkojunkkari. It translates roughly as knife bully or knife fighter, and it describes a specific Ostrobothnian phenomenon of the 19th century, young men, particularly in the rural western regions, who built social status and reputation through knife fighting at gatherings, fairs, and celebrations. The puukkojunkkari culture was not simply random violence. It had its own codes, its own hierarchy of respect, its own celebrated figures who became regional legends. A successful knife fighter was feared, which in a community with limited legitimate routes to status was a form of being respected. The most famous of these was Antti Isotalo, known as the King of Harma, a village in Ostrobothnia, whose reputation as a fighter and an outlaw made him both feared and mythologized in roughly equal measure. Matti Haapoja knew about Isotalo. According to documented accounts from people who knew him, he expressed direct admiration for Isotalo and once stated his own ambition clearly: Antti Isotalo is the king of Harma. I must be the king of Ilistaro. Ilistaro was a neighboring municipality to Iso-Kairo. The ambition itself tells you something specific about the young man, not the ambition to escape poverty, not the ambition to prosper, but the ambition to be the most feared person in a particular geography. That's a specific kind of aspiration, and it takes a specific kind of world to make it feel like something worth wanting. By the 1860s, Haapoja was already building a local record. Brawling, thefts, disrupting local celebrations with a group he had assembled around himself. District court convictions for minor offenses. The documented record notes that local people were afraid to report him, suggesting even at this stage that his reputation for violence had outrun his formal criminal record. In communities where the nearest police presence was a significant distance away and where local social relations had to survive long after any formal complaint was resolved, not reporting a violent man was often the rational choice. Haapoja understood this. He used it. And then Finland's already fragile world collapsed entirely. The Great Famine of 1866 to 1868 is the single most catastrophic event in Finnish recorded history. It killed somewhere between 270,000 and 280,000 people, roughly 8% of the entire population of Finland, in a 2-year period when crop failures produced by a sequence of early frosts destroyed the harvest across most of the country. 8%. If the same proportion of the current Finnish population died in 2 years, it would mean more than 400,000 deaths. The scale of it is almost impossible to process from the outside, but the way it touched daily life in rural Ostrobothnia, one of the worst affected regions, was immediate and specific. Farms that had been marginal became non-viable. Families that had been poor became destitute. Men who had worked for wages found no wages available. The social fabric of communities that already lived close to the edge frayed catastrophically, and the institutions, the church, the local courts, the landlord system, had no adequate response. It is worth pausing on what a famine of this scale actually meant at ground level in a community like Iso-Cairo in the winter of 1866 into 1867. This was not food insecurity in the modern sense. This was starvation. Families watching children die. Communities watching neighbors die. A Lutheran church that could provide prayer and a burial record but not food. In a community where survival was already precarious before the famine, these conditions removed the last of the ordinary social structures that kept men like Haapoja's violence at the level of local reputation rather than lethal consequence. Heikki Antonpoika Imponen was 42 years old in December 1867, with a wife named Kaisa and 3 children at home. He and Haapoja had known each other since childhood. Their fathers had worked neighboring land, they had grown up in the same community, they knew each other the way people know each other in small rural villages, completely, which means a betrayal between them carried a weight a stranger's violence never could. What Imponen had with him that December night, whether money, food, or simply the social standing of a man who still had land and a family, the record does not specify precisely. But he was a man who had something, in a winter when having something and being seen with it was its own kind of risk. He had known young Matti since childhood. That was not enough to protect him. On December 6, 1867, in the middle of Finland's Great Famine, in the depths of a Finnish winter, Matti Haapoja stabbed Heikki Imponen to death. That is the beginning of everything that follows. Here's what the documented record establishes about December 6, 1867, and here's what it leaves open, because this case, across 3 decades, carries more documented uncertainty than most, and naming that uncertainty clearly is the honest way to handle it. What's established? Matti Haapoja stabbed Heikki Imponen to death in a drunken brawl. The killing happened at a gathering. The exact nature of it is variously described as a local wedding celebration or a general community gathering, in the manner of the social events where the puukkojunkkari culture most consistently expressed itself. A knife. A quarrel. A man dead. This is the first confirmed killing. What the documented record cannot tell us, because no account from Haapoja himself survives from this period and the witnesses to the event left no detailed testimony that has survived in accessible form, is what exactly passed between 2 men who had grown up together in a community being destroyed by famine. Whether it was a planned attack, a spontaneous escalation, a fight that went further than either man intended, or something rooted in a specific grievance the record doesn't preserve. The court that sentenced Haapoja to 12 years of hard labor at Turku's Kakola Prison treated it as murder and sentenced him accordingly. The documentary record supports that outcome. What it doesn't provide is a clear narrative about why, on that specific night, one childhood acquaintance killed another. I want to sit with that gap for a moment, because it matters for how we understand everything that follows. There is a version of this story that makes December 6, 1867, a decisive moral turning point, the moment a man chose violence and became something different from what he had been before. There is another version that makes it the logical endpoint of everything that had been building, the culture, the famine, the local reputation, the years of escalating minor violence, two men drinking in a community where ordinary survival had become genuinely difficult. Both versions are present in the historical record. Neither is the whole truth. The court record. 12 years of hard labor. Kakola Prison. Kakola was by the standards of the era a formidable institution, high walls, geographic isolation on a rocky promontory above the Ora River estuary, the institutional weight of the Russian imperial justice system behind it. A man sentenced to 12 years of hard labor there in 1867 was not expected to leave before his time. Haapoja left before his time. The first escape was in 1870, less than 3 years into his sentence. He was at large for several months before being recaptured. He was returned to Kakola. His sentence continued. The second escape came in 1872. Out again, recaptured again, returned again. By 1874, with 2 escapes on his record and a pattern of thefts and violent behavior during his periods at large, a Finnish court sentenced Haapoja to life in prison. He was 29 years old. Life in Kakola. The third escape came in 1875. This one produced the first significant press coverage. In August 1876, during this period at large, newspapers reported that Haapoja had robbed and shot at a man named Esa Nirinen. The initial coverage was sensational. When the fuller facts emerged, they were more complicated. Nirinen had apparently been sheltering Haapoja and the men had quarreled. But the initial reporting had already done its work. Haapoja's name was now a public one, a named outlaw with a press existence that would grow considerably in the years ahead. The fourth escape, in January 1879, was the most violent to that point. During the escape or the recapture that followed, Haapoja stabbed a farmer, identified in the surviving record only as Kuvunyemi from Vahakairo, who survived. Back to Kakola. A life sentence. 4 escapes. 4 escapes from a maximum security prison. A life sentence. A press beginning to mythologize him. And a legal system that had been trying to permanently contain this man since 1867 and had not yet found a way to do it. The institutional reality by 1879 was that Kakola had failed 4 times, and nobody had a credible answer to why the 5th attempt would succeed where the previous 4 had not. Inside Kakola, looking at the shape of what the rest of his life was going to be, Matti Haapoja made a decision that was, by any reasonable measure, extraordinary. He petitioned the authorities to commute his life sentence to exile in Siberia. The authorities agreed. Let me pause on that decision and on that agreement, because both of them tell you something that gets lost in the outlaw mythology. The petition for Siberian exile was, in the 1870s, not an unusual legal mechanism in the Russian Empire. Siberian exile, deportation to remote regions of Russia, typically in western or eastern Siberia, to work in conditions ranging from hard labor to loosely supervised rural settlement, was a recognized alternative to long prison sentences, used for a wide range of offenders across the imperial system. For the Finnish authorities, accepting Haapoja's petition resolved a problem they had failed 4 times to solve, keeping him inside a building. The logic was simple. A man could escape a prison. He could not escape a continent. From Haapoja's perspective, the calculation was different and worth thinking through carefully. A life sentence in Kakola had a known shape: walls, guards, labor, death eventually inside those walls. 4 escapes and a life sentence had not produced any change in that basic equation. Siberia, by contrast, was vast, poorly administered at the margins, and thousands of kilometers from the institutional infrastructure that had managed to recontain him after each of his 4 previous escapes. The Russian Empire sent tens of thousands of exiles to Siberia and relied on geography as a primary containment mechanism, on the assumption that the distances involved made voluntary return essentially impossible. For most exiles, that assumption was correct. Haapoja appears to have looked at Siberia and concluded that distance was a problem that could be solved the same way he had solved every other institutional problem that had faced him, with endurance, violence, and movement. Whether that was rational optimism or a misreading of what Siberia actually entailed is something the subsequent decade answered definitively. He was sent to Omsk Oblast in 1880. Omsk is a major city in west-central Siberia, roughly 2,200 kilometers east of Moscow, a key administrative center of the Russian Empire's Siberian territories. The distance from Iso-Cairo in western Finland to Omsk Oblast, by the route an exile would travel in 1880, was approximately 4,000 to 5,000 kilometers. The distance from the East Siberian territories where he was sent after his 1886 killing, the regions east of Lake Baikal, back to the Finnish border was closer to 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers. Reversal 1. The initial assumption, the one the Finnish authorities appear to have made when they agreed to the exile petition, was that Siberia would hold what Kakola had not. The geography itself would be the prison. A man could escape a building. He could not escape a continent. That assumption held for roughly 9 years. What we know about Haapoja's time in Siberia is sparse by necessity. The Siberian records of this period are poorly documented in Finnish historical sources, and most of what has survived comes from later accounts including Haapoja's own prison memoirs, written under conditions that give every reason for both accuracy about some things and selective memory about others. What the documented record establishes, in 1886, 6 years into his Siberian exile, Haapoja killed a man and was, as a consequence, exiled further east, moved from Omsk Oblast to East Siberia, the vast territories east of Lake Baikal, thousands of kilometers deeper into the Russian interior. Folk stories claim that Haapoja also killed 2 other famous Finnish criminals during his Siberian exile, Juha Antonpoika Leskenantti and Kaapo Sutki, men with their own outlaw reputations who had also ended up exiled. These stories circulated as legend. The historical record provides no corroboration. I mention them because the shape of the telling, the Finnish outlaw who goes to Siberia and dominates the criminal hierarchy there too, tells you something about what his reputation was doing while he was absent from Finland. Reputations, once built, are not bounded by geography. Reversal 2. Around 1889, Haapoja decided to return to Finland. He later claimed his intention was to emigrate to America, to continue west past Finland and start somewhere new. Whether that was genuine or a later rationalization the record cannot confirm. What it does establish is how he funded the journey, a series of robberies and murders across Siberian territory. At least 3 men killed during this crossing, probably 4 when the Russian passport case is included. The man whose documents he used to travel, whose fate the historical record describes only as unclear, almost certainly did not give those documents willingly. In the context of what we know about Haapoja's behavior during this period, unclear fate is not a neutral phrase. The scale of what Haapoja accomplished in returning from East Siberian exile to Finland is worth sitting with precisely, because it tends to get compressed in most retellings into a single sentence. East Siberia, the territories east of Lake Baikal where he had been relocated after the 1886 killing, is approximately 7,000 to 8,000 kilometers from the Finnish border by the most direct route. That distance is roughly the equivalent of traveling from London to Chicago and continuing most of the way to Los Angeles. He covered it largely without authorization, funding each stage through robbery, carrying forged or stolen travel documents, moving through administrative territories where a Finnish-speaking man with a history of violence and no legal status was a significant risk at every checkpoint. He was 43 to 44 years old during this journey. What the journey took physically is something the record does not explain, because Haapoja's own account of it in his prison memoirs is, as Avasti notes, selective and self-serving. What it required structurally is clear: sustained physical endurance over months, the ability to navigate unfamiliar territory without reliable maps or official assistance, and a willingness to use lethal violence when the alternative was capture. All three of those things were present in Haapoja's documented behavior throughout his adult life. The Siberian return was the largest-scale deployment of all three simultaneously. He arrived back in Finland in September 1890. He had been gone for 10 years. He was 44 years old. 1 month later, on October 8, 1890, he murdered Maria Jemina Salo. Reversal 3. The press in Finland in 1890 was a different institution from the local reporting that had first carried Haapoja's name in 1876. The Finnish newspaper industry had grown substantially in the intervening years. The reading public was larger and more engaged with national crime coverage, and the framework for writing about a notorious killer had been transformed by the international coverage of the Jack the Ripper murders in London in 1888. When Haapoja's murder of Maria Jemina Salo was reported, Finnish newspapers explicitly compared him to the Ripper, not because the crimes were similar in character, motivation, or method, but because the template of the monstrous, named, elusive killer was now available in the public imagination. Haapoja had been absent for 10 years. He had returned. He had killed within a month. The press had its story. Maria Jemina Salo deserves more than the role the press and the criminal record gave her. She was in her early 20s, working in the rough districts of the city in the way that young women with limited economic options worked in Finnish cities in this period. She was wearing a silver necklace her mother had given her when she died. That detail comes from the National Museum of Finland's archival research into this case, and it's worth holding. A silver necklace from her mother. Not a statistic in Haapoja's body count. A person with a mother who had given her something to wear and keep. Haapoja strangled her and robbed her. He was arrested shortly after. The Circuit Court of Hausjärvi, in 1891, documented what the surviving sources describe as an arrogant confession. Haapoja's manner in court apparently consistent with the same fundamental disregard for institutional authority that had characterized his entire relationship with the legal system since December 1867. The death sentence he received was commuted to life imprisonment. He went back to Kakola. Here is the full weight of what the Finnish legal system was dealing with by this point. Haapoja had left Finland under an arrangement specifically designed to hold him permanently outside the country. He had returned anyway. He had killed a woman within a month of his return. He was convicted. His sentence was commuted. He went back to the prison he had escaped from 4 times. And the system that had been trying to contain him since 1867, now 24 years into that effort, sent him back to the same building and apparently expected a different result. That expectation was not met. On October 10, 1894, Matti Haapoja made his 5th attempt to escape. This one did not succeed. But in the attempt, he stabbed prison guard Juho Rost and wounded 2 other prison staff. Rost had worked at Kakola Prison for 11 years. His wife was pregnant with their 4th child, a daughter who would be born after her father was already dead, who would grow up knowing him only through whatever stories the people around her could provide. Ross died of wound fever from the stab wounds to his neck, not in the immediate moment of the attack but in the days that followed, in the manner that septic wounds killed in an era before antibiotics. Haapoja, recognizing the escape had failed, turned a blade on himself. 7 stab wounds to the chest. Serious injuries. Not fatal. He was treated in the prison infirmary, recovered, and was placed back in his cell to await trial for Rost's death, what would have been his 3rd murder conviction. Imagine what the Finnish legal system was facing in the autumn of 1894. A man who had been under sentence since 1867. Who had escaped 4 times. Who had spent a decade in Siberia, returned uninvited, killed again, been convicted again, had his sentence commuted, and was now awaiting trial for killing a prison guard in a 5th escape attempt. A man who, when the escape failed, stabbed himself 7 times rather than accept recapture passively. The institution had no good answer for this. It had been answering with the same response for 28 years, walls, sentences, recaptures, and it had not worked once. What do you think came next? Drop your answer in the comments before I tell you, because what happened on January 8, 1895, is the detail that has defined how this case is remembered in Finland, and you already heard it in the cold open of this episode, though it carries different weight now than it did then. Here is what the psychological and historical record actually allows us to say about Matti Haapoja, as opposed to what the mythology around him has claimed, because those are different things, and keeping them separate matters. What the documented record shows about his pattern of behavior across nearly 3 decades is several things worth naming clearly before we get to the mythology. First, Haapoja was consistently opportunistic rather than strategically predatory. His confirmed murders are robbery-related killings, crimes of economic desperation overlaid with a violence that became its own end over time. He was not hunting specific people or pursuing a coherent criminal project. He was a man with a particular toolkit: violence, physical endurance, willingness to keep moving, applying that toolkit to whatever immediate problem presented itself. Second, his relationship with the state was almost entirely adversarial from his first conviction onward, and that adversarialism was actively reinforced by the state's repeated failure to hold him. Every escape validated, in the most practical sense, the proposition that institutional authority was not something that applied to him permanently. Every recapture was simply an interruption. Third, the Siberian period produced a version of Haapoja that the Finnish system had never dealt with before. Whatever he had been in 1867 when he stabbed Heikki Imponen in a famine winter, the man who returned in 1890 had survived things that most people in Finland at that time could barely conceive of. None of that is justification. Heikki Imponen had a wife named Kaisa and 3 children at home. Maria Jemina Salo had a silver necklace her mother gave her and was wearing it the night she died. Juho Ross's daughter was born after her father was already dead from wound fever, and grew up without him. The people Haapoja killed were not abstractions, and the suffering he caused was real, specific, and permanent for the families he left behind. Understanding the structural conditions that produced a man like him is not the same as excusing what he did with those conditions, but the two things have to be held together or the story becomes dishonest in a different direction, becoming the story of a monster who appeared from nowhere rather than a man shaped by a specific set of forces that Finnish society generated and then refused to take responsibility for. Here is the piece the mythology consistently gets wrong. Haapoja is sometimes framed in Finnish popular culture as a romantic outlaw, a man who could not be contained, whose escapes and wanderings carry a certain folk hero energy, who lived by his own code when the state's codes failed him. The puukkojunkkari tradition he explicitly associated himself with had that quality, the knife fighter as a man of reputation, someone who earned the only form of social standing available in a world that had structured out most other options. His skeleton in a museum of crime for a century has a perverse grandeur that the folk hero framing feeds on. The documented record does not support the folk hero version. It supports a considerably grimmer one, a man born into a community about to be destroyed by the worst famine in Finnish recorded history, who found in the puukkojunkkari culture a template for identity that his circumstances made available, who killed a childhood acquaintance in a drunken brawl during that famine, and who then spent 30 years in a cycle with an institutional system that could neither hold him, rehabilitate him, nor offer him anything that made surrender worth choosing. The escapes were not heroic acts of defiance. They were a man with nowhere constructive to go doing the only thing he had learned to do competently across 3 decades: evade confinement and keep moving. The Siberia detail is the one I keep returning to. The Russian Empire sent tens of thousands of exiles to Siberia. Most did not return. The logistics of escape from East Siberian exile in the 1880s, distances, climate, administrative barriers, the need for documents and money in territories where he was an unknown foreign criminal, were prohibitive for almost anyone. Haapoja funded his return with violence, obtained travel documents through violence, and crossed thousands of kilometers of hostile territory at 44. That requires a specific kind of physical and psychological endurance the record doesn't fully explain, because Haapoja himself never fully explained it in the prison memoirs that survive. What those memoirs do reveal, according to Kaija Vasti's 1992 biography which drew on them directly, is a writing style described as turbulent, emotional, self-justifying, marked by the same disregard for external authority that characterized everything else we know about this man. What Haapoja thought of himself appears to have been significantly different from what the evidence of his actions showed him to be. That gap, between how a person narrates their own life and what the record shows about it, is not unique to Haapoja. In his case it is particularly stark. The Finnish newspaper's Jack the Ripper comparison was wrong in almost every particular. The Ripper's crimes were sexually motivated, urban, focused on a specific vulnerable community of women, connected to a very different social and institutional context. But it accidentally captured one true thing. Both figures had a relationship to public narrative that exceeded the documented reality of their crimes. The press made Haapoja larger than the record. The mythology made him larger still. The actual man made his last decision in a prison cell in Turku at 49, before any court could render a verdict on the last act of his life. Whether that final decision was defiance, despair, calculation, or some combination of all three is something the record cannot answer. He left no note. He made no final statement. He left the Finnish legal system, which had been trying to formally conclude his story since 1867, without the ending it had been building toward for 28 years. What that cost institutionally is worth naming precisely. 3 confirmed murder trials. 4 separate escape investigations. A decade of Siberian exile administration. A transcontinental extradition process. A second murder trial. A 5th escape attempt investigation. A 3rd murder trial that never reached its verdict. All of that institutional investment accumulated over 28 years, the police hours, the court sessions, the prison resources, the diplomatic correspondence with the Russian Empire, and the final accounting of it was a guard opening a cell door in the pre-dawn hours of January 8, 1895, and finding nothing left to try. There is one more thing the documented record allows us to say about Matti Haapoja, and it sits uncomfortably alongside everything else in this episode. He was, in one specific and narrow sense, consistent. From the moment of his first conviction in 1867 to the morning of his death in 1895, his behavior followed a recognizable pattern. When confronted with institutional constraint, he found a way around it. Prison walls, a life sentence, a continent's worth of Siberian distance, each one was a problem he eventually solved, at whatever cost to whoever was in the way. The institutional system that tried to contain him for 28 years kept applying the same solution: confinement, sentence, recapture, to a man for whom that solution had demonstrably never worked. What that says about the system is something Finnish criminal justice historians have been examining ever since. It is also worth being honest about what the Siberian return established beyond the physical endurance it required. Haapoja returned to Finland in September 1890 with a forged passport, no legal status, and a murder conviction outstanding from 1867 that had never been formally closed. He killed Maria Jemina Salo within a month. The forensic picture of what those 10 Siberian years had done to his willingness to use lethal violence, whether they had reinforced it, whether the sheer survival cost of the return had made him more capable of it, whether the man who came back was simply more ruthless than the man who had left, is something the surviving record cannot answer. Because the surviving record consists largely of official court documents and a turbulent prison memoir written years later. The interior is closed to us. What is not closed to us is the pattern of outcomes. 3 confirmed murders across 28 years, probably significantly more. 4 prison escapes. A decade crossing Siberia. A 5th escape attempt that killed a prison guard whose daughter never knew him. A trial that never concluded. And 100 years of institutional memory that kept his skeleton on display in a glass case in a police museum in Vantaa, as if making his bones permanent was the only revenge left to a system that had never managed to permanently contain the man they belonged to. He was buried in 1995, in the ground of the municipality where he was born, where he had first said that he wanted to be a king. The famine that produced the world he grew up in killed 270,000 people. The courts convicted him of killing 3. The space of time between those numbers is where this story lives. Heikki Antinpoika Imponen, Maria Jemina Salo and Juho Rost. The system never got its verdict. The dead do not get to wait 100 years and then be buried in peace. That asymmetry is the last honest thing this case has to say. Before we get to what happened after January 8, 1895, it is worth sitting with one more documented detail about the life this case represents, not about Haapoja, but about the world that produced him. The Great Famine of 1866 to 1868 is, in Finnish historical memory, a catastrophe of the first order. It is taught in schools. It has its own museum exhibitions. It is understood, correctly, as a defining trauma in the formation of modern Finnish national identity, a shared wound that shaped everything from the development of Finnish agriculture policy to the character of Finnish Lutheran social solidarity in the decades that followed. What is less consistently remembered is what that famine did to the men at the very bottom of the social structure, the young, the landless, the barely marginal, in the specific 2 years when it was killing roughly 1,000 people a week. It did not kill them all. It left some of them alive in conditions that had stripped away the last of whatever institutional buffer the society had offered them, with a pre-existing local culture that gave violence a language and a status function, and with a legal and penal system that, when it eventually got hold of them, had only one tool: confinement. No rehabilitation. No economic alternative. No institutional response to the underlying conditions that had produced the violence in the first place. Just walls and sentences, and, when the walls failed, more walls further away. Matti Haapoja was one specific man who made specific choices with specific consequences. 3 people are dead because of him, probably more. That is the documented reality, and it is not diminished by any structural framing. But the structural framing is real too. The Finland that sentenced him to 12 years in 1867 had just finished watching. 270,000 of its citizens die, had built no meaningful social infrastructure to address what that had done to the communities that survived it, and had a penal system whose response to a violent young man from a devastated rural community was to put him in a cell and expect that to resolve something. It did not resolve anything. It produced 4 escapes, a decade in Siberia, 2 more murders, a 5th escape attempt that killed a prison guard, and a 3rd murder trial that the defendant ended on his own terms before the court could finish it. What the Finnish legal system got out of 28 years of trying to hold Matti Haapoja was a reformed prison architecture, a set of improved police tracking procedures, and a skeleton in a glass case that stayed on display for a century. What it never produced was an answer to the question his entire life asked of it. What do you do with a man the conditions you built produced, when the only tool you have is the same confinement that demonstrably does not work? This question did not end with Haapoja. It is still being asked. The institutions are different. The conditions are different. The question is the same. There is a specific irony in the fact that the most visible legacy of Haapoja's case in modern Finland is a hotel. Kakola Prison, where he spent more of his adult life than anywhere else on earth, where he escaped 4 times, where he stabbed himself 7 times in a failed escape attempt, and where he died, has been converted into a boutique hotel, restaurant, and cultural venue. Guests book stays there. The building's criminal history is prominently featured in its marketing. You can eat in what were once the prison workshops and sleep in what were once cells. The records of what happened inside those walls are preserved in archives in Turku and Helsinki, available to researchers, available to historians, and available to documentary makers who tell true crime stories to YouTube audiences across the world. The bones of the man who made all of that institutionally necessary, whose 4 escapes drove the prison reform, whose case drove the police procedure development, whose 3 decades of evasion forced a legal system to examine what it was actually doing, spent 100 years in a glass case in a museum 30 kilometers north of Helsinki before they were finally put in the ground. Matti Haapoja was buried in Ilistaro in 1995. He had been dead for exactly 100 years. He was, at last, the king of somewhere, 6 feet of it, in the municipality where he had grown up, in the ground of the country he had spent his entire adult life evading, returning to, and refusing to let have the final word over him. It had the final word anyway. It always does. There was no verdict. That is, formally, the resolution of this case. The 3rd trial never reached its conclusion, the court never returned a finding on the death of Juho Rost, and the Finnish legal system's 3-decade relationship with Matti Haapoja ended not with a sentence but with a dead man in a cell on the morning of January 8, 1895. What happened in the immediate aftermath was its own document of how the society that had produced and then failed to contain him understood what he represented. His body was examined by prison doctors. His physical remains were retained by the state. Specifically, his skeleton was preserved and eventually placed in what became the Museum of Crime in Vantaa, the city immediately north of Helsinki where Finland's National Police College is located. The Museum of Crime was, and in a modified form still is, an institution that holds artifacts connected to Finnish criminal history, evidence, weapons, documents, and, for a century, the bones of a man the state had never managed to hold in life. Haapoja's skeleton was an exhibit. For 100 years, people visited it. For 100 years, a man who had escaped every institution that tried to hold him remained, in death, permanently contained in a glass case in a police museum, which is either a final institutional victory or a final institutional absurdity, depending on your reading. I find it genuinely difficult to write past that detail without pausing. A museum exhibit of a skeleton is a statement about the person those bones belong to. It says that person is a curiosity, a spectacle of criminality, an artifact worth preserving for public consumption. It does not say anything useful about justice for Heikki Imponen, Maria Jemina Salo, or Juho Rost. It does not meaningfully address what conditions produced Matti Haapoja or what might have been done differently at any of the multiple points across 28 years where a different institutional response might have produced a different outcome. It is pure theatre, the state making permanent, on display, the body of a man it had failed to contain for 30 years. Whatever the curatorial intention behind keeping those bones, the effect was to extend the spectacle of his life indefinitely past his death. In 1995, 100 years after his death, on the centenary, Matti Haapoja was finally buried in Ilistaro, the municipality neighboring Iso-Cairo where he had grown up and where he had first expressed the ambition to be the local king. The burial was covered in the Finnish press, including a piece in Helsingin Sanomat, Finland's largest newspaper, titled "Murderer to Rest in Peace." It was the first time his remains had been in the ground. That detail, 100 years between death and burial, carries its own particular weight. The families of his confirmed victims did not get 100 years of public attention. Heikki Imponen is remembered, if he is remembered at all, as the first entry in Haapoja's criminal record. Maria Jemina Salo's silver necklace is a detail in a podcast episode drawing on National Museum of Finland archives, mentioned because a researcher thought it worth preserving. Juho Rost's daughter, born fatherless in 1894, grew up without anyone much noticing. The man who killed all three of them had his skeleton on display in a national institution for a century. That imbalance is worth sitting with. The legacy of his case on the Finnish legal and prison system was, at least, concrete and documented. His repeated escapes, 4 from Kakola alone, plus the decade in Siberia, prompted a thorough review of prison architecture and security protocols across Finland in the years following his death. Kakola Prison itself was substantially rebuilt and upgraded in the years after 1895, specifically in response to what the Haapoja escapes had exposed about its structural vulnerabilities. The investigation techniques developed to track him during his periods at large contributed to the development of modern Finnish police procedures for tracking fugitives. These are real, institutional consequences, the state learning, at significant cost, lessons it should have learned earlier and at lower cost to the people Haapoja killed during the years it failed to contain him. Kakola Prison itself has since been converted to a hotel and cultural center. The cells where he escaped, was brought back, stabbed himself 7 times, and finally died have been renovated into restaurant tables, hotel rooms, and a sauna. Guests' book stays there. The building's criminal history is part of the marketing. The records of what happened inside it are preserved in archives in Turku and Helsinki, available to researchers, generating occasional academic papers and occasional documentary scripts for YouTube channels that cover global true crime like a documentary. The question of how many people Matti Haapoja actually killed will never be definitively answered. 3 confirmed by courts. At least 2 more connected to prison escape attempts. At least 3 documented during his journey back from Siberia, probably 4 when the Russian passport case is included. 1 in Siberia in 1886 that resulted in his eastward exile. Various other cases connected by documented suspicion rather than formal finding. Some accounts record claimed confessions of 18 total killings, others cite estimates up to 25. The honest figure is at least 3 confirmed, significantly more probable, with the maximum plausible range somewhere between 15 and 25 depending on how much weight you give the Siberian period accounts. The documented certainty is small. The probable reality is considerably larger. What the record does give us is the shape of the life. A famine that killed 8% of Finland's population in 2 years. A knife-fighting culture that gave violence a language and a social function before the law arrived. A first killing in 1867 that was probably shaped as much by desperation and intoxication as by premeditation. A prison that could not hold him. A continent that almost held him but not quite. A return, another murder, a commuted death sentence, a failed final escape, a man's daughter born without a father, and a January night in 1895 when a thread came loose from a woolen sock and a decision was made that the Finnish state had no part in. The famine that produced the world Haapoja grew up and killed 270,000 people. The courts convicted him of killing 3. The space between those 2 numbers is where this story actually lives, in the conditions that made men like him, the institutions that failed to contain them, and the victims on both sides of that failure whose names deserve to be said clearly. Heikki Anton Poika Imponen. Maria Jamina Salo. Juho Rost. The system never got its verdict. The dead don't get to wait 100 years and then be buried in peace. That asymmetry is the last honest thing this case has to say. If you're into true crime documentaries that put the structural conditions of violence alongside the violence itself, subscribe to Enter the Crime, and tell us in the comments, at what point do you think the Finnish system should have handled this differently?